Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Lorenda Calvert, and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar topic is Succession Planning, Planning for Plan B. This webinar will be presented by Tammy Bradford. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn here in mutual respect and appreciation. We also recognize the traditional lands of the many nations across British Columbia where the work of the projects described in this webinar have been carried out. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our webinar sponsor today, Lucidia. Lucidia is a software solutions company based in Richmond, BC. They develop collections management software systems that are suitable for libraries, archives, and museums, both large and small. Lucidia's motto is, redefine how knowledge is shared, which is quite fitting for a webinar sponsor. We thank Lucidia for supporting BCMA as we seek to share knowledge through our webinar series. As I mentioned, I am Lorenda Calvert, your host for today. I am also BCMA's programs coordinator. I've been with the organization for 3 months now, and I think I've got a good handle on Zoom and webinars, but if there are any technical difficulties, please bear with me. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, please do email our office. Vanessa, our operations manager, is standing by to assist, and her email is on the screen now. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you are reading this slide and hearing me talk, you are doing great. If you can't, don't shout at your screen because we won't be able to hear you. Simply use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. It may be hidden, so if you hold your mouse either at the top or bottom of your screen, the feature menu should emerge. Please use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments. I will read your comments or questions up to the host. We have saved some time at the end for a good Q&A portion, so if you can save your comments and questions to the end, that would be greatly appreciated. As I mentioned, this month's presenter is Tammy Bradford. Tammy is from the Creston Museum. And that's a lovely photo of Tammy there with a wonderful group of folks out on a rainy day. And now, Tammy, over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can share yours.
Okay. Are we good?
We're all good. So I'm just going to mute myself, but I am here in the background.
Okay. So, hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. This is the first webinar I have ever given, so I admit I'm a little bit nervous, especially about the technology side. But I'm very glad to be able to share some of the experience we've had in developing an emergency succession plan for our staff here at the Creston Museum. The Creston Museum is a very small community museum, and we're located in a very small town where we are not only the only museum, but our staff constitute the only heritage professionals in the community, and in fact, also constitute most of the professionals in the entire local cultural sector. For 15 years, I was a staff of one. We had a large number of very dedicated volunteers, each who had their own areas of interest, but I was the only person in the entire organization who dealt with all areas of our operations. Even now that we've been able to hire a second staff person, she's our program coordinator, and she knows that end of our operations very well, but not so much the many other aspects. So, without either an internal pool of people to draw from in the event of a staff emergency, nor potential help out there in the broader community, the question that keeps coming up is what happens if I am not able to do my job? We have had many, many conversations about succession planning over the years, and the same questions keep coming up. Not all of them are directly related to emergency staff succession, but I'm sure they'll all be pretty familiar to you. How do we recruit people, whether it's board members or volunteers? How do we transfer knowledge or ensure smooth transitions from one person to another? How do we plan for doing this when we have no idea when or even if we will ever need it? How on earth do we find time to do this? Because we're all so busy just doing our jobs. And of course, the big question, dealing with my eventual retirement seems pretty straightforward, We will have advance notice of when that happens. We can hire someone to take my place while I'm still on the job. I can train them for at least a few weeks before they take over. Presumably, I would also be somewhat available to answer questions afterwards too. But how do we deal with my sudden and unexpected departure? How do we deal with it if I am not only unavailable to help train my successor, but also unexpectedly unable to do any part of my job until that person is hired? How do we keep the museum operating? How do we make sure that the 1,000,001 little day-to-day things are happening in some way, shape, or form? We discussed a number of potential strategies for this. The most obvious one was recruiting and training somebody to take over, actually hiring somebody to job shadow me for 6 months or a year or however long we could make it work, so that if my wayward reindeer came along, they could simply step in and fill my shoes. But there are some huge drawbacks to this one. Unless they are permanent staff and my wayward reindeer comes along very soon after the end of their work term, they're not likely to be available. You know, who would sit around waiting for a job that may not open up? And in any case, their knowledge is going to be outdated if it's more than a few months. It's also hugely expensive. And believe me, if we could afford to hire somebody to shadow my job for 6 months, we probably wouldn't be in this situation of a small staff with nobody to take over. We'd also talked about relying on department managers, you know, people in each area of operations who could take over. And these might be short-term staff or board members or volunteers. But again, we realized that they might be able to take over one area, but not all, or certainly not all, possibly not even any others. Especially if they're volunteers, they might not be at all inclined to take on a larger role. And depending on the time of year that my departure occurs, they might not even be available. Summer students, for example, wouldn't be available if I went downhill skiing and met a tree in January. The third strategy we talked about was creating a resource or how-to manual for our emergency responders. And this last one is the one we ultimately went with, since it seemed the least expensive, didn't require anything but my time, and the most long-lasting, something that we could put together once and have available for as long as we needed it. And you can see there, we actually did call it Everything You Need to Know About Running a Museum. And these are just a few snapshots of some of the pages inside. This, it turns out, is very time-consuming to compile and unexpectedly requires almost constant updating. There's always something that changes. It contains a lot of sensitive information that we don't really want widely distributed. That was a risk management thing. You know, there's always the risk that somebody could get the usernames and passwords that are in this binder, but we had to balance that risk against the risk of that information being lost if it was all in my head and nowhere else. We also found that this is good for long-term reference, but completely impractical for immediate deal-withable stuff that needs to be done right now. Nevertheless, it does address the questions that we thought somebody taking over for me would need to know. And then we had a bit of a trial run when I unexpectedly wound up in the hospital. I was there for a week, had about 2 weeks of recovery time after that. And that's when we discovered that the very first thing our emergency volunteer office staffer needed to know wasn't any of those things we'd put in our how-to manual. No. The very first thing she asked was this. That's not in the book, and even if it was, the book is inside the building. And her second question was, okay, what do you want me to do while I'm there? And the book didn't answer that question either. Fortunately, this happened in January, which tends to be a quieter time of year, and we knew it was temporary. We only had to get through a few weeks and then everything would be fine again. But imagine if it had been summer with a busy schedule of programs and events and 3 or 4 summer students looking for direction and a steady stream of visitors with expectations of their own. And the only thing we had told our volunteer staffer was that the water shutoff is under the sink. So that's what led us to create this. It's a very brief emergency guide that answers those immediate questions. How do I get into the building? Who do I contact? Who has keys? What needs to be done right now? The moment I walk into the door, what's the first thing you need me to do? What needs to be done this week, this month, in the next few months? So looking ahead, basically from the moment you get that call, hey, something's happened, we need you to take over, to the time when a new senior staffer can realistically be expected to take over, that's what this guide does. It is much easier to keep updated than the full reference manual. It contains relatively little sensitive or security information, so we can give a copy to as many people as we feel necessary. It's far less overwhelming than the 150 pages of how-tos in the reference manual. And most importantly, it gives a prioritized checklist, something for someone to follow until they can catch their breath and get themselves sorted out. Putting this together also helped us identify other things we could do to help someone deal with my sudden departure. Some are just a matter of changing my routine, such as including full details of events and activities in my Outlook calendar and making sure to include everything from grant reporting deadlines to scheduled school visits. Others are more ongoing, like improving the training that we're providing for staff and volunteers, or making sure that the reference manual includes site-specific how-tos, not the general how to write a grant, because all of that stuff is out there in other resources, but how we do things here. These things are more ongoing. Some of them are quite a challenge, but they're things that I'm continuing to work on as time allows. So our approach to emergency succession planning actually encompasses 4 different strategies. We are working to ensure that we have someone, paid or volunteer, who knows at least one area of operations thoroughly and could take over and possibly even train others in it if needs be. This is a tough one. Again, you don't always have volunteers who want to take on that kind of responsibility, but we're plugging away at it. Since we do at present have not 1 but 2 additional staff members, we're taking steps to make sure that they have at least some knowledge of every area of operations. We know we might not always have this luxury, but while we do, we're taking advantage of it. We have our emergency brief to provide immediate guidance to anyone and everyone who might be called on to take over at a moment's notice. And we do make sure that is widely distributed so that if the emergency happens when 3 of those people are out of town, there's still somebody else, several somebodies in fact, that we can call up. And we have our resource manual that, yes, does take a lot of time and is always out of date in one respect or another, but it's something to fall back on at least. So our process for getting to this point was rather hit and miss. Like I say, our first attempt missed the mark by a very, very long mile. But when I look back on it, there is a process that we should have followed and that I would follow if I were to do this again with another organization. So remember, our goal was not to set up plans for replacing somebody that we can predict is going to leave, though I do have some suggestions for that. We'll get to that in a minute. But rather to deal with that immediate period when somebody is gone who you've relied on and you need to deal with the day-to-day stuff. So it was to create the tools and resources necessary to ensure the continuing smooth operations of the organization in the sudden and unexpected absence of the one person who does it all. So step 1, identify the person whose sudden absence would create havoc for your organization's day-to-day operations. Chances are you already know who that is. Chances are you don't have very many people to choose from, but it's worth taking a look at if you've got a couple of staff people or a team of volunteers. Who is the person who coordinates all of those activities? Do you have somebody who coordinates those activities, or are you looking at replacing several people in several different areas of operations? Step 2, remember it's not the person so much as the loss of their skills or knowledge or abilities. So be specific. Why exactly would their sudden absence be such a problem? And it might not be what you think. And if it's yourself that you're looking at replacing, one thing that I learned through our process, you need to set your ego aside. The things that you are most proud of in your abilities are not necessarily the things that need to be replaced. In my case, it's not the fact that I have a pretty good success rate when it comes to writing grants, or I can give a dynamite guided tour. No, those skills, lots of people have those skills. And there's lots of ways to gain them if you don't have them. What we would need to replace is the minute details of day-to-day operations. Who's doing what, what's coming down the pike, where are we at with all of these different projects? That's what's all in my head, and that's what needs to be replaced. So once you've identified those gaps, brainstorm all the strategies you can possibly come up with to address them. Don't be too quick to dismiss the seemingly far-fetched and impossible ones. Just throw them all out there, all of these possible strategies that you could come up with. And then sit down and identify the pros and cons of each one. Look for ways to mitigate the drawbacks to each and choose the most practicable and logical ones. Don't be afraid to implement more than one. As we discovered, a single strategy was not at all adequate. In fact, the strategy that we chose didn't help at all in that situation where I wasn't available and I couldn't help anybody through what needed to be done. And also, remember, just because one strategy might not be available permanently is no reason not to implement it while it is available. As we've found with our staff, we know we're not going to have 2 additional staff people forever, but we have them now. And your emergency could happen tomorrow, so why not be prepared with the resources you have today? You can deal with it later if those resources change. Step 5, implement those strategies now. Whatever it is you've identified as the best way or ways of moving forward in the case of a staff emergency, get those things in place right now. Don't wait. Remember, this is an emergency plan, and the only thing you can be sure of is that you won't have time to get it ready when the emergency happens. So make sure it's ready now. And finally, reassess, reevaluate, and repeat regularly. Every year at minimum, more often if your strategies rely on staff or volunteers and you've experienced some turnover. The last thing you want is to phone somebody up and say, hey, we need you to take over, and they're trying to phone somebody to get into the building who is no longer living in town. So make sure that those details are as up to date as you possibly can, however often it means you have to do that. So that will help you get you through the first few weeks after your key person gets abducted by aliens. But even if your senior manager simply retires with plenty of advance notice rather than winding up on Pluto, you still need to have resources in place to ensure that transition happens smoothly. So while you're looking at what you can do to deal with an emergency transition, you might as well look at some of the long-term stuff as well. Now, remember, it may not be at all necessary to try and download your current key person's brain for the benefit of their successor. Presumably, you are going to hire a competent professional who will have their own way of doing things, who will have some basic knowledge at least, even if it's an entry-level candidate. They'll have some basic knowledge, I hope, of how museums run and how things should be done. And moreover, the succession might be an ideal time to move the organization in a new direction. If you've been feeling you need to do that when you've got somebody new coming in, that could be a good thing. Even so, your board, your hiring committee, and your senior manager is going to need something to go on. So the things that we realized we need when we developed our resource manual and later our emergency plan, first of all, a job description, up-to-date, accurate senior manager's job description, including current salary and benefits and actual hours of work. I want to emphasize that actual bit. I'm sure you're all nodding that, we all work more hours than we're actually paid. Your directors and your hiring committee need to know that. They need to know what they are replacing. And if they're trying to replace a job that they say takes 30 hours and it takes 50 every week, you're just going to have endless turmoil when your incoming senior manager realizes that the job is not what they thought and moves on or gets completely stressed out. So when I gave this seminar at the BCMA conference last year, one of the people in that group said that they are working on an up-to-date senior staff positions job description, but their board doesn't want any input from the senior staff person. And I'm sure the board has their reasons for it, but I can't say I agree at all. Especially in a smaller organization, I'm pretty sure your senior staff person, whether they're paid or volunteer, has a better idea of what is going on and how much time it takes and what skills and resources are necessary to get it done than most volunteer directors in a small town are likely to be aware of. So I really think your senior staff person now needs to be very closely involved in preparing that job description and making sure it's as accurate as possible. Another thing that we realized we need and don't have entirely yet in our reference manual is very detailed and complete organizational histories, incorporation documents, policies, overviews of history, progress, or changes in your main areas of operations, such as collections practices, major donations, public programming, any obligations that you have to the community, to funders, to major stakeholders. This should all be written down somewhere. And you might already have it in the form of strategic plans or similar documents, but you need to know where it is and how to get it to everybody who's going to need it. You also need current and long-term project documentation, anything that needs to be carried through to completion, even if the organization is changing direction. This is for the reference of both your hiring committee or board of directors and the incoming senior manager. Especially if it's grant funded, you don't want to wind up in the situation a couple of years down the road where you've spent all of the money for that grant, but didn't do the project because you didn't know that project was actually on the table. Another very important thing, property and facility maps. Building plans, construction and maintenance records, equipment manuals, security access, anything like that is, I'm sure it's much easier to plan things if you know what your facility has and what it's capable of. And presumably your incoming senior manager is going to be the first person called on in a facility emergency, so they need to know all of this. Another good thing to have is an organizational chart or support staff job descriptions, or even just their titles and contact information, whether they are paid or volunteer. If your senior manager comes in knowing that certain areas are under control and they can rely on these people, then that person can focus more on the specific parts of their job that are not being already covered. If you are changing direction or you've got some challenges, your new staff person, your new senior manager will probably make some changes, but in the meantime, until they've got their feet underneath them and have things kind of sorted out, make sure they know who they can rely on. And finally, what I call day-to-day information. So login information, everything from how to fix glitches with your email to logging into your website to update hours of operation. So much is happening online. Make sure that somewhere, as secure as you can make it, but still accessible, you've got all of those passwords and usernames and such, so that your senior staff person can access the things he or she needs to do. Contact information for directors, volunteers, key suppliers, funders, anybody who you feel your staff person might need to contact. Account numbers, bank accounts, WorkSafe BC, you name it, anything that has a number attached to it. And anything else that you find yourself regularly needing to look up, or that you've made a point of memorizing so you don't have to keep looking it up. your incoming senior staff person needs to know where that is. And this information like that should also be in your emergency plan, just in case you can't be there to tell them. And again, that's a bit of a risk management thing that we debated back and forth on, but we did feel, okay, if we've got one copy of our reference manual and the only people who know where it is are the people who we trust to come in and keep things going in the first few months, we can probably manage that risk adequately. So there you go. That's what we did. Any questions or comments or discussions?
Thank you, Tammy. Here, I'm just going to take over the screen.
Okay.
And pop up my mine again. So Tammy, thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful and great to hear your process. For our participants in the webinar today, if you do have any questions, please use the chat window or the Q&A window if you can't find the chat window, and I will read your questions out to Tammy. If you can't find the chat or Q&A, just a reminder that if you hover your mouse over the top or bottom of your screen, you may be able to have the bar pop up where you can fill in the chat. Tammy, for myself, a question for you. You mentioned reassessing or reevaluating frequently. Are there moments that you've thought of that have occurred at the museum where you thought this would be a really good time to sit down and re-look over this? Was there anything that prompted it, or is it just something that you look over, you know, annually when you're doing your year ahead planning?
Yeah, a bit of both. You know, we've only had that emergency guide for about a year now, so it's definitely time, but specific times, for example, if you change your signing authority at the bank, or if you change who has access to your security alarm systems, who has those codes, that sort of thing, or if staff leave. You know, like I say, ours kind of based on having a couple of staff people. It says right in there, Allison and Alyssa know what they're doing, just rely on them. Well, Allison's going on mat leave in September, so there will be a rewrite in another couple of months on that one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I for the moments I've had emergencies like a power outage or a fire, it's moments like that afterwards that I thought, oh, we don't have it documented that so-and-so is the only person who has that key now.
Yeah.
Or there was that thing that came up that I didn't even think about during that emergency, and we should make sure that's documented. But yeah, staff leaving, definitely.
Yeah, there's nothing like the emergency itself to make you realize all the things that you need in place to do it. And I'm quite certain if we have an emergency, our little guide, we will learn that, yep, there's still something missing, but it's a place to start at least.
Absolutely. We have a question here from Kat. In the case of a volunteer/board member taking over duties in a pinch, as it were, is there a plan for monetary compensation for stepping into a coordination role?
We don't have that plan. That is definitely something that's worth thinking about. Yeah, we don't have one, but yeah, I think it would depend on the organization and its finances, and of course the volunteer as well who takes on it and how long it went in. But that's maybe something we should put in the what should I do in the next month or so, is look at how long is this going to take and whether you need to be compensating your volunteer, because it does require a lot of time. Even for us, when I wound up in the hospital in January, and this was a number of years ago, of course, but you know, our volunteer was there for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. And that's, you're right, not something that you necessarily want to expect somebody to do on a volunteer basis, especially if it looks like it's going to be a lengthy period.
Thank you. As we wait for some more questions to come in or chats, do you have any thoughts on having digital or print copies of this, or both, as many copies as you can? What are your thoughts on that?
Ours is print, though we've got it, it's in a PDF format, so we can send it out to whoever needs it. We have not really embraced cloud storage yet. We're starting to in some ways, but most of our volunteers aren't at this point entirely comfortable with it. So they prefer things, they can handle an email attachment that they can print out, but they prefer something that they can hang on to. And we've also found with this one, because it is a checklist, if you could print it out and go check, 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 I've done that, it really helped as a kind of a reassurance to our potential emergency staffers that, they do have this, they can handle it, they can get through it. So I think that would depend on who you're looking at and what their preferences are.
Absolutely, good point. And I think also, just as I asked my question, I started to think, if you have too many copies, then you've got so many more copies that you need to update when you have more information that comes out.
Yeah. And basically when we get around to updating ours, which like I say is going to be very soon here, we'll basically just send it out or give a fresh copy to everybody and go, okay, destroy the other one. So we don't have a date on the original one, but I think we'll definitely be dating the updated version and all subsequent versions, just so that people know which is the most recent one.
Absolutely. Now, I know you mentioned earlier in the webinar about the amount of time it takes to put together that very detailed succession plan.
It's insane. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts or advice or tips on managing that? Because some organizations do still need to take that time to make those really big detailed plans. Any tips?
Yeah, from what we learned, I would say focus on the site-specific stuff first. So if you have a collections database that is unique to your organization, absolutely do a how-to for that. If you're using something that has manuals out there, I don't know, Lucidia or Past Perfect or any of these ones that are more broadly available and might come with a user's manual, you might not need to focus on that quite so much. With grants, you might not need to worry about how to write a grant so much as these are the grants we worry about, these are their deadlines, these are the projects that we often do. And really all I've done in that one is say, yeah, everything is saved in my documents. Go look in my documents. The folder that says grants, you will find past examples of grants there. Cut and paste, copy, use as a resource, whatever you want. And that saved me a lot of time, especially since when we started working on that reference manual, Young Canada Works was using this particular platform, and then not long after that, they changed platforms, and the whole how-to that I'd written that took hours and hours and hours to write a how-to on how to apply for a Young Canada Works grant, it all changed. Well, you probably don't need to go into the detail of in this field type this sort of thing, because Young Canada Works has excellent resources for that, and they're getting stronger and stronger all the time. So I would say use the resources that are out there, make sure people can find them, but focus on the site-specific stuff, and then add to it as necessary. But the more you write, the more you're going to have to update.
Great idea. We've got a question here from Craig. How do you control keys used for your doors for your buildings? Numbered keys, signed pages, and how do you track equipment which might be taken off site? An example, a camera.
Yeah, we actually have very little equipment that's taken off site. It's something that we are going to have to look at eventually as we're starting to move more towards working at home. This COVID thing has changed everything for us, as I'm sure it has for you. So we don't have sets or formal systems in place for that. Key holders is documented through the minutes of the board. It's basically me, our permanent staff, and 2 or 3 board members who have keys. And we have a list of that in the minutes. And then I've included that in the emergency brief. These are the people who have keys. I also have a phone list right by my phone on the message pad, in fact. You know, that sheet of cardboard that you put in between the pages so you don't get the message written through several layers. That's where I've put the emergency contact. So it lists all of our board members with the ones who have keys in bold. We don't have a system of numbered keys. It's never yet been a problem. Or I shouldn't say that. The one time it was a problem, we needed to change all of the locks, but there were some that were so old. There was one that had been jury rigged, and we just changed all of the locks anyways because they needed it. So perhaps not the most strategic way of dealing with it, but it worked for us at the time. So yeah, if we had more frequent turnover, then we would probably have to go to some kind of a numbered system and make sure that we get those keys back. But at this point, you know, I've been there for 22 years, and our other staff person has been there for 6 now, and Allison has every intention of coming back when she's finished with her mat leave. So yeah, our turnover is pretty slow, so we've not had to worry about that yet.
Which is very lucky.
Very lucky, yeah.
I've seen systems from, you know, just a clipboard and a piece of paper that's stored in someone's lockable office to Excel sheets, binders. For those places that do have such a large number of keys or staff or turnover, I think just finding the system that works for you to make sure that nothing's falling through the cracks is the best you can do.
Yeah, and whatever solutions we do use are going to be as low tech and as straightforward as possible. Again, technology is constantly changing, and if we have to keep updating our emergency responders on how to use the technology, we're just adding a whole new burden onto ourselves. And also, our time is so limited that, you know, we can't keep changing things every time technology changes. So like you say, a clipboard hung in the office, or a page, which we have right now in our emergency binder or our emergency brief or our bigger resource manual, you know, that's probably the way we'll go.
And my apologies if you've mentioned this during the webinar. Do you do annual training in regards to these plans, or is it something that someone is introduced to when they start? How frequently are you discussing these plans with your staff?
At this point, on an as-needed basis. Our turnover isn't nearly big enough or fast enough to make any kind of an annual schedule at all make sense. But we've got our AGM coming up, so we'll have some new board members. We'll be doing it then, making sure that everybody's familiar with it. Our summer staff, we don't, that's where almost all of our turnover is in summer staff. And, you know, they don't have access or security access. They need somebody else to come in and unlock the buildings for them. So we are beefing up the training that we do with them to a certain extent, so that they, if I don't show up tomorrow morning, they could cope with their day-to-day jobs. But yeah, for the most part, it's just an on as needed basis.
Which I think is a good plan, just so that everyone's on the same page, you know, and is informed.
Yeah. The tricky part where we're not quite, and this is totally on me, is thinking as soon as we have a new board member come in, we need to do this. You know, this is also very new to us. Like I say, we've had that emergency brief for a year. Okay. When Allison says she's going to be going on mat leave, my first thought isn't, okay, we need to update that training manual. My first thought was, okay, I've never had anybody deal with mat leave, so how do I do this? You know, so that thought process, that making sure that our plan is front and center and the first thing we do when we have one of those changes. We still have a ways to go before we get there, but we're working on it.
That's good. Just keep, you know, always working on it. Always great. We have a question here in the chat from Wendy asking, would you share your emergency brief with us? And I just want to confirm, is that the document that you have sent me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yes.
The one
Fantastic. Sorry?
The one with the reindeer on the front cover?
Yes. So I just want to inform Wendy, if you're still in the webinar, that we will be sending that out in our follow-up email. Everyone who is registered for this webinar will get an email with a recording of this webinar, and we can send out the emergency brief, which Tammy has already provided me with.
Yep.
Wonderful. I don't see any more questions or anything else in the chat. Tammy, any last thoughts before we wrap up today?
No, I don't think so, but if anybody's wants to contact me, you're more than welcome to. I'm more than happy to share our lessons learned with you. And like I say, it is something we are still learning. So who knows, I might have some different advice if we have another issue somewhere along the line. But yeah, for now, that's where we are. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. This is a topic that I especially enjoy learning about. I think it's always super valuable. I was stuck in an emergency situation when I was a very new hire at an institute, and it has laid a good foundation for me to remind myself and the necessary requirements of having these procedures created, documented, shared, updated. So I really appreciate you taking the time today, Tammy, to join us and to share your knowledge and your experiences with everyone else. Extremely, extremely valuable. Thank you so much.
You are quite welcome.
And for our participants, we just want to let you know we've got some more things going on in June. We have a webinar coming up on June 24th titled #Museums Are Not Neutral, White Supremacy in Museums and Calls to Immediate Action. And please, you will receive a follow-up survey in your inbox. Please fill it out. It just helps us know what kind of webinars you're looking for and what we can do better. And if you are not yet a member with the BCMA, please consider becoming one. Membership brings funding opportunities, free webinar participation, reduced registration fees for our annual conference, regional workshops, and other special events, as well as access to professional development resources that support you and the work of your museum, gallery, cultural center, archives, library, including the Roundup magazine, regular e-newsletters, and access to job posting, contract opportunities, and much, much more. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you again, Tammy, and I hope everyone has a very wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, Lorenda.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.